Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you've had a good lunch and enjoyed the networking opportunities. Still a bit of a novelty, isn't it, this kind of in-person kind of interaction. It's certainly my first event, I think, in probably 2.5 years. I'm sure that's the same for many of you. So good to be back a little bit, at least, to business as usual. That's not what I'm going to be talking about in this session, though. So let's see if we can move it on. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say that geopolitical risk is something that's on most of our minds right now. But it's not always been the case. Certainly most of the studies I've conducted in supply chain risk over the last 10 years or so, you would have seen things like wars, major terrorist attacks, social unrest being pretty low down on the list of concerns for procurement leaders, for supply chain leaders. So we conducted a study that Scott mentioned, this was how the sample described geopolitical risk in terms of the factors they were most concerned about when they evaluate suppliers. So 24% of our sample said, yes, geopolitical risk is something that we're pretty concerned about. That was before the 24th of February. We actually went back. I looked at these results and I thought that's a bit embarrassing because we're now in a sort of war situation. So we actually went back to a sample of the original panel and asked the same question. And as you can see, the figure more than doubled. Now, to give you an idea of in terms of the figure on the left, the 24%, that's less than half those that would have put things like financial risks, ESG risks, cyber security risks in their top three. So I think what this says to us, pretty obvious, wars disrupt global supply chains pretty quickly and pretty heavily when there's a lot of dependence on a particular country or a particular region. So what I'd like to do in this session is give you a few more insights from the study that we recently conducted, really around the kind of the four areas that you can see on this agenda slide. And just before I do that, just to give you an idea, we surveyed 1,500 procurement, IT, and IT security professionals in January, February, and March of this year. 5 major industry sectors, that was aerospace and defense, financial services, pharmaceuticals, IT and technology, and central government. The respondents pretty evenly spread between the US, the UK and Ireland, Germany, Austria, France, and Canada. And in terms of kind of organization size, they were all over $1 billion of annual revenue, and I think about 2/3 were between $5 billion and $50 billion in annual revenue. So quite large organizations. I should say also that we're not actually publishing the findings of this research until next month. So I'm very pleased to say that you are the very first audience that we're presenting this to. You're getting a bit of a sneak preview. So I hope that proves to be interesting and useful for you. So let's start with the first theme. Global supply chains are being reconfigured in response to disruptive events. You can see here, hopefully most of you, even at the back, can sort of read this. I did try to make the text as big as I could, but about 2/3, almost 2/3, told us that they are making wholesale changes to their supply chain footprints, whether in terms of where they produce products, where they deliver services, where they distribute from, where their supply bases are located. And I think clearly we've seen major disruptions over the last few years in terms of the trade war between the US and China, the pandemic, and now, of course, the war in Ukraine. So at the same time, we're seeing a certain amount of pushback against the idea of globalized supply chains, where things are produced and made and sourced, in the cheapest part of the world possible. So there's political reasons as much as anything there. The other thing that I would just point out is when we ask, are you concerned about your concentration of suppliers in one particular area of the world? Again, you can see 86% agree with that. And so, when we think about something like the war in Ukraine, clearly that's been a big consideration in terms of our reliance on key commodities. Let me just give you one example of that in sort of high tech. So if we look on the left-hand side, obviously Russia, a big supplier of, in this case, palladium, one company producing about 40% of the world's supply. In Ukraine, 2 or 3 companies control about 50% of the market for semiconductor-grade neon gas. On the right-hand side, obviously, with what's happened over the last few months, there have been a lot of fears about China's intentions towards Taiwan. And risk and dependency is hugely concentrated there as well. China controls over 80% of the mining and production of rare earth minerals used in all sorts of high-tech devices, from flat panel displays to fuel cells. Taiwan actually controls 90% of the manufacturing of the most advanced semiconductors, those with fewer than, or transistors below, I think, 10 nanometers in size. But it also controls almost 2/3 of the global market for semiconductor manufacturing, full stop. Now, I could have put, of course, up on this a sort of an energy supply chain example. We hear this morning Gazprom closing down supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. I think Bulgaria is reliant on Russia and on Gazprom for about 90% of its gas requirements. Poland, more than 50%. So these are significant levels of concentration risk. Okay, so that's just a snapshot, a very quick snapshot in a couple of areas in terms of how disruptions are reshaping people's thinking and ultimately, in some cases, their supply chains from a physical standpoint. Let's move on to the second point. Supply chain disruptions are frequent, expensive, and often hidden from view. Well, that sounds like I might just be kind of stating the obvious, so let's try to quantify that a little bit. Talking to supply chain leaders over the last 3-4 years, what you constantly hear is the speed and the number of events that our teams are trying to manage and deal with. It just seems to be getting, they're getting more frequent. And I think this kind of just validates that. So the average number of significant supply chain disruptions that organizations we polled experienced in the past 12 months was 3, and 20% said it was more than 5. So that's clearly a significant problem. Why? Because it affects supply availability, it extends our lead times, it causes us issues in fulfilling our obligations to our customers. But of course, it also has a cost and a financial impact in terms of having to source from elsewhere, off contract, expedited logistics, the cost of, in some cases, having idle production lines, as we've seen in sectors like automotive. And in some cases, in the retail space, there may be penalties that our companies are going to be exposed to if we don't deliver on time and in full. This is a hard one to quantify, but overall, we found that the average cost to organizations of supply chain disruptions, $182 million, or 1.74% of annual revenue. So this sort of figure would be about right for a $10 billion company. So that's a pretty sizable figure. Where do these disruptions occur? Well, of course, we know that they don't just occur with the suppliers that we directly do business with. I think about 90% of our sample reported disruptions below Tier 1. That's to say the suppliers they directly contract with and purchase from. About 3/4 said it was below Tier 2. Why is that an issue? Well, most organizations I talk to don't have good visibility at, that far upstream in their extended supply chains. That makes it hard for us to anticipate events, know about them soon enough, and take action to deal with them. Here's an example of that. So this is a supplier experiences a geopolitical event like we're seeing at the moment. So we asked, how confident are you would be able to know about that in a fairly quick and timely way? 52% in this case say they think they would know about that at tier 1 or tier 2. But as you can see from the bar or the column chart, once you start getting beyond that, confidence levels drop pretty dramatically. And I could show you another 5 or 6 examples for other kinds of events, an ESG violation, a supplier insolvency, a cyber attack, and those figures are not significantly different. Let's take an example of that sub-tier visibility. So if we go back to to Taiwan and its domination of semiconductor manufacturing. So we ran some analysis on the Interos Global Relationship Mapping platform, just taking kind of Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers. And if I move this on, you can see that as far as US companies, US buyers, and also European companies are concerned, the direct relationships with the sort of companies you see on the left-hand side of this slide in the hundreds. Once you start moving to the indirect relationships, tier 2, tier 3, you can see the numbers pretty quickly grow exponentially. So in the tens of thousands, or in the case of tier 3, hundreds of thousands of dependencies and interconnections that companies don't necessarily have visibility of. So the question here is, and hopefully this will never happen, if China tries to retake Taiwan by force, as many people are concerned that they will, how many buyers would actually really understand their dependency on Taiwan for these types of products? And what would they be able to actually do to try to mitigate and manage that risk? And that's really a massive challenge for organizations. This just obviously is one example. So the third area, that really sort of brings us on to the fact that, and again, it's fairly obvious, and we've heard a lot about it at this event so far today, risk practices and technology require at least further improvement from where we are today. Now, in terms of risk analysis, I'm a firm believer that, as was said in one of the earlier sessions, you need to prioritize where you focus, you need to target your efforts. Usually this is based on some kind of segmentation of our supply base. That's great. Our finding shows that of direct suppliers, only just over half are actually included in any kind of systematic risk analysis. To me, that leaves us exposed as organizations to all sorts of potential threats and risks. And so, while it's fine to prioritize, segment, target your efforts, you also need to make sure for both resilience, operational resilience reasons, but also for compliance, regulatory compliance reasons, that you're actually including more suppliers in your kind of risk analysis. The other thing that's concerning is how often do we actually monitor supplier risk? 11% of our sample of 1,500 told us they'd do that continuously. Another 3/4 say they typically do that weekly, monthly, or perhaps quarterly. To me, in the kind of fast-moving, rapidly changing environment, volatile world that we now live in, doing this on a sort of periodic basis, frankly, is not going to be that useful. And so there really is more of a need to be able to get more timely information, be able to anticipate and respond to events much more quickly than this type of monitoring would suggest. Now, technology clearly has a role to play in this. You can see on the left-hand side here some of the benefits of using technology for supply chain risk management purposes. So of course, the ability to analyze and ultimately to mitigate risk is super important. I think it's interesting that getting some kind of competitive advantage over other rivals or competitors in your sector is also quite high on the list. And what that says to me is that risk management is not just about trying to manage the downside, the negative impact. It's also about trying to take opportunities where they exist. Looking down the chart a little bit, you can see being able to manage and reduce costs and get greater visibility for different types of risk events, also key benefits. I think visibility is certainly a major area, a major focus for technology solutions, but also investments right now. So we saw just under a fifth of our sample saying, yes, we've already got advanced technologies, those using some kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence, automation to help bring us this visibility across a very complex network. I guess the good news is that about 3/4 also said we're either have this, but we haven't implemented it yet, or we plan to introduce it. So I think this just underlines how foundational visibility is in supply chain terms today. And you can see that when we ask about the role of software vendors like Interos, in helping to bring that visibility and to make supply chain risk more visible across different functions, different stakeholders within our organizations. More than 8 out of 10 said that has a value to us. So obviously good news for companies like mine, but I think it just underlines the importance of visibility more generally. And I think that brings me on to the fourth and final area I wanted to cover, which is that operational resilience is a multiplayer game. This is how we define operational resilience at Interos. So it's the ability to continue providing products or services in the face of adverse market or supply chain events. An operationally resilient organization, I'll go back one, manages risk in a strategic and proactive way to prevent, respond to, and recover quickly from disruptions that could impact its customers, its brand reputation, its financial performance, and, to my point a minute ago, also to seize new business opportunities where they arise. Now, that's quite a tall order, and to me it's not something that a single organization can do on its own. It requires collective responsibility. That starts within the four walls of the organization. So you can see, again, nearly 8 in 10 of our 1,500 respondents saying that they agree they need to do a better job of collaboration and information sharing within their own organization, between different functions.
A little bit of bio.
So for things like cyber risks, that means that procurement and supply chain need to collaborate with our IT colleagues, our information security colleagues. For ESG, it means sustainability, legal functions as well. For financial risks, we need to work clearly with our finance colleagues and others. But I would also say, and you can see on the right-hand side, those organizations where you have an overarching enterprise risk management function, they need to be involved in this as well, because supply chain risk doesn't exist in a vacuum. It needs to be tied into the way that organizations view, manage, and ultimately respond to risks of all different varieties. The second thing is clearly supplier, the way we engage and collaborate with our suppliers has a massive role to play, and the number, again, very similar. So again, collective responsibility means how we work with partners across that extended network, that ecosystem. Why is that important? Well, I've just listed 3 reasons. I think if you don't have collaboration and certainly trust based situation. Suppliers are going to be very wary about sharing sensitive data with you or potential risks that they may know about. Maybe they know that that Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturer is having a capacity problem. Are they going to tell you about that far enough in advance that together you can actually do something about it? Second point is that things like business continuity plans, contingency plans, they need to be understood between different organizations, and in some cases they actually need to be stress tested to make sure that they're actually going to be effective in a disruptive situation. And finally, risk mitigation strategies, whether we're talking about extra inventory, additional capacity, redundant capacity, or alternative sources, often that requires coordination, joint decision-making, aligned processes, in some cases joint investments, as well as shared metrics, shared incentives. So as I say, supply chain risk and resilience, operational resilience, not something that the supply chain or the procurement function can do in isolation, and it's certainly not something that the organizations that you work in can do on your own. So finally, let me just kind of leave you with a few recommendations for kind of action based on what we see here. So the first thing is, really look, when you're thinking about your networks, your supply chains, think about that concentration risk. Where do we have the most critical raw materials, components, parts, indeed services that are located in a particular area of the world or with particular suppliers that give us cause for concern? You can't mitigate in all circumstances, but you can certainly target areas for diversification. I'd also say be realistic about opportunities for reshoring and nearshoring. Our survey actually found quite high levels of expectation about that, but if you saw the report that the International Monetary Fund published earlier this month, they actually caution against that and say what we really need to be focusing on is diversification of supply chains. I think that's really the watchword. Proactive risk mitigation and resilience building requires preparation, it requires planning, it requires strategy. So if you don't have the resources to do that kind of upfront work, rather than simply reacting or firefighting all the time, you may need to make a case for that if you haven't already done so. And you certainly need to focus beyond the suppliers that you directly do business with, even assuming you know who all of those organizations are. As I said, it's good to prioritize and target, but you also need to make sure that you've got sufficient breadth of risk analysis, and also that you are monitoring those risks on a more regular basis. Ideally, it would be real time, but of course that's not always possible, but that's certainly the direction that things are moving in, so that you can make more timely decisions where it's possible to do so. Invest in technology solutions. Again, that's obvious from our perspective, but I think getting greater visibility, understanding some of those interdependencies is absolutely fundamental, as well as being able to keep track of different events that are going on across the world, whether big or small. And then finally, this idea of collective responsibility. So making sure that you've got the mechanisms, the processes in place internally to facilitate a kind of a collective effort, and externally that you're able to work with at least your most important strategic and critical supply partners to manage risk across that broader ecosystem. So with those final thoughts, I will see if we have time for questions. Scott.
Thank you. Great session so far. There's a bit more as well. Does anyone have any questions from the floor before we start? Because I do have some great questions that have come in as well. And I noticed there were lots of people, I was lurking at the back there, I saw lots of people with their phones taking pictures of some of the slides, because you're giving us an exclusive today. I believe that this presentation is going to be shared, or the report is going to be shared, with all the attendees when it's released next month as well. So good that you've been taking notes, but you will be the first to receive this in your inbox as well. So a couple of questions we have here. Risk mitigation strategies can be expensive, it says here, and time-consuming to put in place. How do you suggest leaders approach this?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. Certainly all of the research I did at Gartner over the last few years showed that the cost challenges when it comes to risk mitigation and risk investment, or proactive risk investments, are the number one challenges. And I think that, again, emphasizes why you need to take a very deliberate and targeted approach to where you decide that you've got, let's say, over-concentration of risk and you actually need to do something about it that may cost money. I would also say, though, that the cost of inaction can be pretty substantial, and I think we've seen plenty of examples of that over the last few years. So I think taking a very deliberate approach, clearly you need kind of buy-in at a senior level within the organization for some of these decisions. So in some cases, you're going to have to make a business case. I had plenty of calls with clients who are desperately trying to quantify that in the old way. Some organizations will insist on that. Others, will just kind of take more of a leap of faith. So I think it's a difficult area, but there is a cost to not doing anything here, and that can absolutely outweigh the cost of, beefing up your capabilities.
Okay, good answer. And just one final question as well, and if you can sum this up in a minute, that'd be brilliant. If multi-tier supplier visibility is as important as you suggest, then why do so few organizations seem to have mapped their supply chains? Yeah, again, another hugely difficult area. And so, that's absolutely right. We've seen, I remember when we saw that earthquake and tsunami in Japan 11 years ago, that really caught, so many well-regarded companies, whether they're in the high-tech space or the automotive space or other sectors, out. I think the short answer is, there's just so much complexity. There's so many moving parts in terms of locations, suppliers, sources of disruption, types of risk. At tier one, let alone once you start going upstream. So I think it's a huge manual workload, and most organizations, frankly, don't have those resources or have not been prepared to commit those resources. I do think over the last few years, the technology, data analytics, and so on is beginning to help with this problem. It's not the full solution right now, but it can certainly help to make this a little bit more realistic and practical. So I think, most organizations, certainly in all of the research I've done, do not have visibility beyond tier 1 or 2, and they're certainly not taking steps to try and manage risk there. But the lessons of the pandemic, the war, etc., really show that is, unfortunately, difficult as it may be, necessary. Okay, thank you. Geraint John from Interos. Thank you. Let's take that. Thank you.